The first snowfall of December 1873 arrived early in Lyndon, Kansas, coating the small frontier town in a blanket of white that seemed determined to stay until spring. And Juliana Davidson knelt in her garden behind the general store with dirt under her fingernails and hope in her heart, despite the frozen earth that resisted her every effort. She had arrived in Lyndon 3 months ago with nothing but a carpet bag and the clothes on her back, fleeing from a marriage her father had tried to arrange in Philadelphia. At 22 years old, she had decided her life was her own to live, and if that meant starting over in a dusty Kansas town where women were scarce and questions were plentiful, then so be it. The owner of the general store, Mrs. Martha Henderson, had taken pity on her and offered her a room above the shop in exchange for help with the customers and inventory. It was honest work, and Juliana was grateful for it, but gardening was her passion, her solace, the one thing that made her feel truly alive. Back in Philadelphia, she had tended her mother's garden until her mother passed away 2 years ago. After that, the garden became her refuge from her father's increasing demands that she marry the son of his business partner, a man twice her age with wandering hands and bourbon breath. Now, in this frozen Kansas earth, she pressed seeds into the ground with trembling fingers, her breath coming out in white puffs. The other townspeople thought she was mad, planting in December. Even Mrs. Henderson had gently suggested she wait until spring. But Juliana had read about winter sowing in a farming journal, about how some seeds needed the cold to germinate properly, how they would be ready to burst forth the moment the ground thawed. It was an act of faith, of believing in something that could not yet be seen. She was so focused on her work that she did not hear the footsteps approaching until a shadow fell across her garden plot. "You are going to freeze out here," a deep voice said. Juliana looked up to find a man standing at the edge of her garden, tall and lean, with sandy brown hair that fell just past his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He wore a worn leather coat and dusty boots, and there was something gentle in his expression, despite the hard lines of his sun-weathered face. "I am aware of the temperature, thank you," she said, sitting back on her heels. Her hands were indeed numb, but she was not about to admit it to a stranger. "I did not mean to offend," he said, holding up his hands. "I am Franklin Foster. I work at the ranch just outside town. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you might need some help turning the soil for your garden." Juliana frowned. "I did not ask for help. No, but Martha worries about you out here in the cold. She asked if I could spare an afternoon." He gestured to the frozen ground. "That earth is not going to be easy to work alone." She wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage, but the truth was her hands were blistered and her back ached from days of fighting the stubborn soil. Pride was one thing, but practicality was another. "Very well," she said, "but I am particular about how it is done." Franklin smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "I would expect nothing less from a woman planting seeds in December." He had brought tools with him, a pickaxe and a sturdy spade, and he set to work with an easy competence that spoke of years of hard labor. Juliana watched him for a moment, then returned to her own work, carefully spacing out the seeds she wanted to plant. Hollyhocks and larkspur, poppies and sweet peas. All flowers that could withstand a cold start. They worked in silence for a while, and Juliana found herself stealing glances at him. There was something peaceful about his presence, none of the bluster and bravado she had come to expect from the cowboys who passed through town. He worked steadily, breaking up the frozen clods of earth with patient determination. "Why flowers?" he asked after a while. "Most folks around here plant vegetables, things they can eat." "Mrs. Henderson has a vegetable garden," Juliana said. "This is different. This is for beauty." "Beauty," he repeated as if testing the word. "We could use more of that around here. You think I am foolish?" Planting in frozen ground, he paused in his work and looked at her directly. "I think you have hope. That is not foolish. That is brave." Something in her chest tightened at his words. No one had called her brave before. Reckless, perhaps. Stubborn, certainly, but not brave. "What brings a woman from back east to Lyndon?" he asked, returning to his digging. "How do you know I am from back east? Your accent, the way you hold yourself. You are not from Kansas." Juliana considered how much to tell him. "I wanted a fresh start." He nodded as if that explained everything. "A lot of people come west for that. And you, are you from here? Born in Missouri, but I have been in Kansas for 10 years now. Came out after the war." She did some quick arithmetic in her head. "How old were you?" 14 when I enlisted." Lied about my age. 26 now and feeling older some days. There was a weight to those words, a history she suspected he did not share easily. The war had ended 8 years ago, but its scars were still visible everywhere, in the burned-out farms and the men who woke screaming in the night. "Do you like it here?" she asked. "In Lyndon?" "It is as good a place as any. The work is honest. The people are decent mostly. It is quiet." "Do you want quiet?" He stopped digging and met her eyes. "After the noise of war, yes, quiet is good." They continued working until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and pink. Franklin had turned over a significant portion of the garden plot, and Juliana had managed to plant 3 full rows of seeds. "Thank you," she said as he gathered his tools. "You did not have to help, but I am grateful. I will come back tomorrow if you like. Make sure you get the whole plot ready before the next snow." "You do not have to do that." "I know," he said, "but I would like to. If you do not mind the company." Juliana realized she did not mind at all. "Tomorrow, then." He tipped his hat to her and headed down the street, his long stride carrying him quickly into the gathering dusk. Juliana watched him go, something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. That night, lying in her narrow bed above the general store, she thought about Franklin Foster and his quiet strength, his gentle hands breaking apart the frozen earth. She thought about the way he had looked at her garden with understanding rather than mockery. And she thought about spring, when the seeds she had planted would push through the soil and bloom. Franklin returned the next day as promised, and the day after that. Within a week, the entire garden plot was prepared, the soil turned and ready. But even after the work was done, he kept coming back. He would stop by in the late afternoon after finishing his work at the ranch, and they would walk through the town together, discussing plans for the garden. "You should plant some herbs too," he suggested one day as they stood at the edge of the plot, now covered with a fresh layer of snow. "Mint and thyme, they are hardy and useful." "I thought you said most people plant vegetables," she teased. "Most people do, but you are not most people." It became a routine. He would arrive just as the winter sun began its descent, and they would talk about gardening and weather and the small happenings of the town. He told her about the ranch where he worked, about the cattle drives he had been on, about the endless Kansas sky that made him feel both small and infinite at the same time. She told him about Philadelphia, about the row houses and the cobblestone streets, about her mother's garden that had been her sanctuary. She did not tell him about her father or the arranged marriage, not yet. Some stories needed time. December turned into January, and the cold deepened. Snow fell almost every week, and the town seemed to hunker down against the harsh winter. Juliana continued to work in the general store, measuring out flour and sugar, cutting fabric for the women who came in to make new dresses, listening to the gossip that flowed as freely as the creek in summer. The women of Lyndon were curious about her relationship with Franklin Foster. Mrs. Henderson fielded the questions with practiced ease, but Juliana could feel the weight of their speculation. "People talk," Mrs. Henderson said one morning as they unpacked a shipment of canned goods. "It is what they do in small towns." "Let them talk," Juliana said. "We are just friends." "Are you?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her knowing eyes twinkling. Juliana did not answer because she was not sure herself. What she felt for Franklin was growing into something deeper than friendship, something that made her heart beat faster when she saw him walking down the street toward her, something that made the harsh winter days feel warmer. In mid-January, a blizzard hit Lyndon with a ferocity that trapped everyone indoors for 3 days. Juliana spent the time in her room, reading and sewing and trying not to worry about her garden beneath all that snow. When the storm finally cleared, Franklin was the first person at her door. "I need to check the garden," she said, already reaching for her coat. "I will come with you." They trudged through snow that reached above their knees, making their way to the back of the general store. The garden plot was completely buried, unmarked except for the fence posts that still stood like sentinels. "It is all right," Franklin said, seeing her distress. "The snow is insulation. It will protect the seeds." "How do you know?" "My mother used to garden in Missouri before she died. She taught me that winter is not death, it is rest. Everything is just sleeping, waiting for the right time to wake up." Juliana felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from the cold or his words she could not say. "I hope you are right." He reached out and took her hand, his gloved fingers wrapping around hers. "I am." It was the first time he had touched her, and even through the layers of wool and leather, she felt the connection like a spark. February arrived with slightly warmer temperatures, and the snow began to melt in fits and starts. The town emerged from its winter hibernation, and life resumed its normal pace. Franklin continued his visits, but now they lasted longer, stretching into the evening. Mrs. Henderson began inviting him to dinner, and the three of them would sit around her small table, eating stew and cornbread and talking about everything and nothing. One evening, after Mrs. Henderson had retired to her room, Franklin and Juliana sat by the fire in the store's small parlor. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the wind howled outside, but inside it was warm and peaceful. "Can I ask you something?" Franklin said, his voice quiet. "Of course." "Why did you really leave Philadelphia?" Juliana had known this question would come eventually. She stared into the fire, watching the flames consume the logs. "My father wanted me to marry someone I did not love, someone I could not respect. I refused, and he said I was ungrateful, that I was throwing away a good opportunity. We argued for months. Finally, I realized that if I stayed, he would wear me down eventually, so I left." "Does he know where you are?" "No. I sent a letter to my aunt telling her I was safe, but I did not say where I had gone. I know she will not tell him." Franklin was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it?" "Leaving? No, never." She turned to look at him. "I regret hurting my father, but I do not regret choosing my own path. You are braver than you give yourself credit for, or more stubborn," he smiled. "Maybe both." She wanted to ask him about his past, about what he had seen in the war, but she could see the shadows in his eyes and knew that some wounds were too deep for easy conversation. "Tell me about your mother's garden," she said instead. His expression softened. "It was not big, just a small plot behind our house, but she loved it. She grew tomatoes and beans, flowers along the edges. She used to say that gardening was like prayer, putting your faith in the ground and trusting that something good would come of it. She sounds wonderful." She was. "She died of fever when I was 12. After that, my father could not seem to settle anywhere. We moved around a lot until the war started. Then I enlisted and he drank himself to death within a year. I am sorry." It was a long time ago. But she could hear the grief in his voice, old and familiar. Is that why you helped me with the garden? Because of your mother, he considered this. Maybe partly, but mostly because I wanted an excuse to talk to you. Her heart skipped. You needed an excuse. You seemed like the kind of woman who would not appreciate a cowboy just walking up and trying to court her. Court me. The words came out more breathless than she intended. Is that all right, if that is what I am doing? She looked at him, at his honest face and his hopeful eyes, and felt something bloom in her chest. Yes, that is all right. He reached for her hand again, and this time there were no gloves between them, just skin on skin and the warmth of palm against palm. I know I am just a ranch hand, he said. I do not have much to offer, but I am hardworking and honest, and I would treat you well. Franklin, she said softly, I did not leave Philadelphia and everything I knew to marry for money or status. I left to find something real. Is this real? He asked, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. Yes, she whispered. This is real. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. She did not want to. When his lips touched hers, soft and tentative, she felt like one of her seeds, long buried in frozen ground, finally feeling the first warmth of spring sun. The kiss was gentle and sweet, and when they pulled apart, they were both smiling. I have been wanting to do that since the first day I met you, he admitted. You hit it well. I did not want to scare you off. I do not scare easily. I am learning that. March arrived, and with it came the first real signs of spring. The snow melted in earnest, revealing the muddy earth beneath. Juliana checked her garden every day, looking for any sign of green, but the ground remained stubbornly brown. Give it time, Franklin told her. Spring comes late in Kansas. I know. I am just impatient. That is because you have been waiting all winter. They were courting openly now, and the town had accepted it with varying degrees of approval. Most people seemed pleased that Juliana had found someone, though a few of the older women clucked their tongues about the speed of modern romance. You have only known each other a few months, Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house said one day when Juliana was helping her select fabric for a new dress. How long did you know your husband before you married? Juliana asked politely. Well, that was different. We had known each other's families for years. Franklin and I may not have known each other long, but we have spent nearly every day together. I know his character. I know his heart. Mrs. Patterson sniffed but said nothing more. In truth, Juliana was surprised by the depth of her feelings for Franklin. She had never believed in love at first sight, had always thought it was something from novels and fairy tales. But what she felt for him was undeniable. He made her laugh with his dry humor. He listened when she talked about her dreams for the garden, for the future. He was patient and kind, strong but never domineering. And when he kissed her, which he did with increasing frequency now that they were courting, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. One Sunday in late March, Franklin took her out to the ranch where he worked. It was a sprawling property with hundreds of head of cattle and a ranch house that had seen better days. The owner, a man named Samuel Briggs, was gruff but fair, and he greeted Juliana with grudging respect. So you are the woman who has got Franklin daydreaming when he should be working, Samuel said. Juliana felt herself blush. I hope I have not been too much of a distraction. A man needs something to work for besides just a paycheck, Samuel said. Makes him more focused, not less, if he has got something waiting for him. Franklin showed her around the property, introducing her to the other ranch hands and the horses he cared for. There was a chestnut mare named Rosie who nuzzled Juliana's hand looking for treats. She likes you, Franklin said. She does not like most people. Maybe she can sense that I like her friend, Juliana said, looking at Franklin meaningfully. They walked out to a small rise that overlooked the ranch and the prairie beyond. The grass was just starting to green up and the sky was vast and blue. "It is beautiful," Juliana breathed. "It is home," Franklin said, "or as close to home as I have had in a long time." She slipped her hand into his. "I want to tell you something." "All right." "When I first came to Lyndon, I was running away from something. But now, being here with you, I feel like I am running toward something instead, toward a future I actually want." He squeezed her hand. "I feel the same way. After the war, I was just drifting. Working from ranch to ranch, town to town, I did not have a reason to stay anywhere. But then I met you, and suddenly Lyndon feels like exactly where I need to be." "Do you think we are moving too fast?" she asked. "Everyone seems to think we are." "You think we are?" "No. I think when you know, you know." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. "I know," he said softly. "I love you, Juliana." Her breath caught. They had not said those words yet, though they had been hovering in the air between them for weeks. "I love you too," she said, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He kissed her then, long and deep, and she melted into him, feeling safe and cherished and whole. April brought warmer weather and rain, blessed rain that soaked into the thirsty earth. And then, one morning in mid-April, Juliana saw it. A tiny green shoot pushing up through the soil in her garden. She ran to find Franklin, who was helping Samuel repair a fence near town. She grabbed his hand and dragged him back to the garden, pointing at the small sprout. "Look, it worked." "They are growing." He laughed at her enthusiasm, wrapping his arms around her waist and lifting her off her feet. "I told you to have faith." Over the next week, more shoots appeared, dotting the garden plot with green. Juliana tended them carefully, watering and weeding, protecting them from the late-season frosts that still threatened. Franklin helped her build a small fence around the garden to keep out rabbits and other animals. They worked side by side, and Juliana marveled at how easy it was to be with him, how comfortable. "I want to marry you," he said one afternoon as they were tying the last fence post. She looked up from her work. "What?" "I want to marry you," he repeated, setting down his hammer and turning to face her fully. "I know we have not been courting long by conventional standards, but I do not care about convention. I care about you. I want to build a life with you. I want to help you plant gardens every spring and harvest them every fall. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. Will you marry me, Juliana?" Tears filled her eyes. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and she could feel his heart hammering against hers. "I do not have a ring yet," he said apologetically. "I do not need a ring, I just need you." "You will have both," he promised. They were married 6 weeks later, on the first day of June, in the small church in Lyndon. Mrs. Henderson stood up as Juliana's witness, and Samuel Briggs stood up for Franklin. The whole town turned out for the wedding, filling the church to capacity. Juliana wore a simple white dress that she and Mrs. Henderson had sewn together, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Franklin wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes shining with love as she walked down the aisle toward him. The ceremony was short and sweet, the Reverend's words about love and commitment echoing in the small space. When Franklin kissed her as his wife, the congregation erupted in applause. The reception was held outside the church, with tables laden with food that the townspeople had contributed. There was music and dancing, and Juliana felt like she was floating. "Happy," Franklin murmured as they danced together under the stars. "So happy I could burst," she said. "Good, because I plan to make you this happy every day for the rest of our lives." They spent their wedding night in a room above the saloon that the owner had generously offered them. It was not fancy, but it was private, and that was all that mattered. Franklin was gentle with her, patient and loving, and when they finally came together as husband and wife, Juliana felt complete in a way she never had before. This was what she had been waiting for, what she had risked everything to find. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I never thought I could be this happy," she whispered. "Neither did I," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Juliana Foster." "Juliana Foster," she repeated, testing out her new name. "I like the sound of that." The next morning, they began their life together in earnest. Franklin had saved enough money to rent a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but enough for the two of them to start. It had a front porch and a decent-sized yard, perfect for an expanded garden. Juliana gave notice at the general store, though Mrs. Henderson insisted she could come back anytime she wanted. "I will miss having you around," the older woman said, "but I am happy for you. You and Franklin are good together." Juliana spent her days setting up their home, making it cozy and comfortable. She sewed curtains for the windows and made quilts for their bed. Franklin built her shelves for her books and a table where they could eat their meals. And every day, she tended her garden. The flowers she had planted in the frozen ground were blooming now, a riot of color that made their yard the prettiest in town. Hollyhocks stood tall against the fence, their pink and white blooms nodding in the breeze. Larkspur added splashes of purple and blue, while poppies provided bright spots of red and orange. Sweet peas climbed the trellis Franklin had built, their delicate flowers perfuming the air. Neighbors would stop by to admire the garden, and Juliana would share seeds and cuttings, helping them start their own gardens. She became known as the woman who could make anything grow, the gardener who had faith enough to plant in frozen ground. But it was not just her garden that was blooming. Her marriage to Franklin was flourishing too. They fell into an easy rhythm, learning each other's habits and quirks. He left for the ranch before dawn and came home at sunset, always with a kiss for her and a kind word. She cooked their meals and kept their home, but she also kept her independence, her spark. They talked about everything, their dreams and fears, their pasts and their hopes for the future. Franklin told her more about the war, about the things he had seen and done, the nightmares that sometimes woke him in the middle of the night. She held him through those dark moments, whispering words of comfort until he could sleep again. She told him about her mother, about the guilt she sometimes felt for leaving her father alone, even though she knew she had made the right choice. Franklin listened without judgment, understanding that love and duty were complicated things. Summer turned into fall, and Juliana harvested the last of her flowers, saving seeds for the next year. She dried some of the blooms, hanging them in bunches from the rafters of their little house, so they would have color through the winter. One evening in October, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Juliana told Franklin she was pregnant. He stared at her for a moment, as if processing the information, and then a huge smile broke across his face. "Really, we are going to have a baby. In the spring," she said. "Around April, the doctor thinks." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "A baby," he whispered, "our baby. Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it. I am thrilled. I am terrified. I am everything all at once," she laughed. "Me too." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. I am your father, and I already love you more than I thought possible." Tears streamed down Juliana's face. "You are going to be a wonderful father. I am going to try. I want to give our child everything I did not have. Stability, safety, love. You are already giving them that." Winter came again, cold and harsh, but Juliana did not mind. She was warm in their little house with Franklin by her side and new life growing inside her. She spent the short days knitting tiny clothes and dreaming of spring, when her baby would be born and her garden would bloom again. Franklin was attentive and protective, always making sure she was comfortable, that she was not working too hard. He took on extra chores around the house and brought home special treats from town to tempt her appetite when morning sickness made eating difficult. "You are spoiling me," she protested one day when he arrived home with a jar of imported jam. "Good," he said. "You deserve to be spoiled." In December, exactly 1 year after they had met, they stood together in her garden plot, now covered with snow. "This time last year I was planting seeds in frozen ground," she said. "And I was watching you, thinking you were either crazy or brilliant. Which conclusion did you come to?" "Both," he said, kissing her cold nose. "Definitely both," she laughed. "And now here we are, married, with a baby on the way. Best year of my life," he said simply. "Mine too." They went inside and sat by the fire, Juliana working on her knitting while Franklin read to her from the newspaper. It was a quiet domestic scene, the kind she had always dreamed of but never thought she would have. January and February passed in a blur of preparation. Franklin started building a cradle, working on it in the evenings by lamplight. Juliana sewed blankets and gowns, her hands moving with practiced ease despite her growing belly. Mrs. Henderson threw her a small party, inviting the women of the town to bring gifts and advice. Juliana was touched by the generosity of people who had been strangers just a year ago but were now friends. In March, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of green appeared in the garden, Juliana felt the first contractions. Franklin rode like mad to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Henderson, and then he paced in the front room while the women tended to Juliana. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day. But when Juliana finally heard her baby's cry, all the pain melted away. "It is a boy," Mrs. Henderson announced, placing the tiny, squirming bundle in Juliana's arms. "A boy." She had a son. She looked down at his red, wrinkled face and felt her heart expand with love so fierce it took her breath away. Franklin was allowed in then, and he came to the bedside with tears streaming down his face. "A son," he whispered. "We have a son." "Do you want to hold him?" Juliana asked. Franklin nodded, too overcome to speak. She placed the baby carefully in his arms, and he cradled his son with the same gentle competence he brought to everything he did. "Hello, little man," he said softly. "I am your papa. I have been waiting to meet you." The baby opened his eyes, unfocused and blue, and seemed to look right at Franklin. "What should we name him?" Juliana asked. They had discussed names over the winter but had not settled on anything definite. "Thomas," Franklin said, "after my mother. Her maiden name was Thomas." "Thomas Foster," Juliana said. "I like it." "Thomas Franklin Foster," Franklin added, "if that is all right with you. It is perfect." They spent the next few weeks in a haze of sleeplessness and wonder, learning to be parents. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, with a lusty cry that made his presence known. Juliana nursed him and rocked him and sang him the lullabies her mother had once sung to her. Franklin was a devoted father, getting up in the middle of the night to change Thomas and bring him to Juliana for feeding. He would hold his son for hours, just watching him sleep, marveling at the tiny miracle they had created. "I never knew I could love something this much," he said one night as they both watched Thomas sleep in his cradle. "I know," Juliana said. "It is overwhelming sometimes. Good overwhelming, though, the best kind." Spring arrived in full force, and Juliana's garden exploded with color once again. She would take Thomas outside and lay him on a blanket in the shade while she worked, talking to him about the different plants and what they needed to grow. "Just like you," she told him. You need sunshine and water and love to grow big and strong." Thomas would wave his little fists in the air and coo, and Juliana's heart would fill with joy. The town celebrated with them, everyone stopping by to see the baby and bring gifts. Franklin's boss, Samuel, gave Thomas a tiny pair of leather boots. "For when he is ready to learn to ride," he said gruffly. Life settled into a new rhythm. Franklin continued working at the ranch, but now he came home to a wife and son who greeted him with love and laughter. Juliana tended her garden and her baby, finding fulfillment in both. One evening in June, as they sat on the porch with Thomas sleeping between them, Franklin reached for Juliana's hand. "You remember last year at this time? We had just gotten married." "Of course I remember. How could I forget? I meant what I said in our vows. I am going to love you and cherish you for the rest of my life. I know you will, just as I will love and cherish you. You changed everything for me, Juliana. Before I met you, I was just existing, going through the motions. But you gave me a reason to live, to hope, to dream. You did the same for me. You helped me bloom." He smiled at that. "Like your flowers." "Exactly like my flowers. You and this town, this life we have built together, you are my spring after a long, cold winter." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the prairie, their son sleeping peacefully between them. It was a simple moment, but it was perfect. The years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. When Thomas was 2, Juliana gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Juliana's mother. Franklin cried when he held her for the first time, this tiny girl with her mother's dark hair and delicate features. "She is perfect," he whispered, "just like her mother." Thomas was fascinated by his new sister, wanting to hold her and help care for her. Juliana taught him to be gentle, and he took his role as big brother seriously. The garden expanded each year, and Juliana began selling seeds and flowers at the general store. It gave her a sense of purpose beyond her home, and the extra money was helpful as their family grew. When Margaret was 3 and Thomas was 5, another son arrived, whom they named Henry. He was a robust baby with Franklin's sandy hair and a temperament as sunny as a summer day. Franklin had been promoted to foreman at the ranch, which meant better pay and more responsibility. He hired and trained the new ranch hands, managed the cattle operations, and reported directly to Samuel. It was demanding work, but he loved it, and he was good at it. Their little house became too small, and Franklin began building a larger home on a piece of land he purchased just outside town. It had room for the children to run and play, and a big yard where Juliana could plant the most extensive garden she had ever attempted. The new house took 2 years to complete, with Franklin working on it in his spare time and on weekends. The whole family would go out to the building site, the children playing in the dirt while their parents worked. It became a labor of love, every board and nail infused with their dreams for the future. When they finally moved in, Juliana stood in the middle of the large kitchen and spun in a circle, her arms outstretched. "It is wonderful," she said. "Better than I ever imagined." Franklin came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You are wonderful. This is just a house. You make it a home." They had been married for 7 years, and Juliana loved Franklin more each day. He was patient with the children, teaching Thomas and Margaret to ride, showing Henry how to stack blocks. He was kind to her, still bringing her little surprises from town, still kissing her goodbye each morning and hello each evening. Their physical relationship had only deepened over the years. They found time for each other, even amid the chaos of raising children. Stolen moments of passion and intimacy that kept their connection strong. One night, after the children were asleep, they made love in their new bedroom, the windows open to let in the spring breeze and the scent of flowers from the garden below. "I love you," Franklin murmured against her skin. "I will never stop loving you." "And I will never stop loving you," she replied, pulling him closer. Life was not without its difficulties. There were years when drought killed the crops and money was tight. There were illnesses that kept them up at night with worry. There were disagreements and misunderstandings, moments of frustration and exhaustion. But through it all, they had each other. And they had the foundation of love they had built, as sturdy and reliable as the house Franklin had constructed with his own hands. Thomas grew into a smart, serious boy who loved books and learning. Juliana taught him to read, and he devoured every book they could get their hands on. Franklin was proud of his son's intelligence, even though it was clear Thomas would not follow him into ranching. Margaret was her mother's daughter, passionate about gardening and growing things. By the time she was 8, she had her own small plot where she experimented with different plants and kept meticulous notes in a journal Juliana had given her. Henry was the adventurer, always climbing trees and exploring, coming home dirty and grinning. He reminded Franklin of himself at that age, full of energy and curiosity about the world. When Juliana was 35 and Franklin was 39, their fourth and final child arrived, another daughter they named Catherine. She was a surprise, coming 10 years after Henry, but she was welcomed with open arms. "Our last baby," Juliana said, holding Catherine close. "Our last," Franklin agreed, though there was a note of sadness in his voice. He loved being a father, loved the chaos and noise of their full house. "We have been blessed," Juliana reminded him. "4 healthy, beautiful children, a good life, each other." "You are right. We have been more than blessed." The years continued to pass. Thomas left home at 18 to attend college in Lawrence, something that would not have been possible without the money Franklin had carefully saved over the years. He wanted to be a teacher, and both Juliana and Franklin supported his dream. Margaret stayed close to home, helping Juliana with the garden, which had grown into a small business. They supplied flowers for every wedding and funeral in town, and their seeds were sold in general stores throughout the county. Henry, at 16, was working alongside his father at the ranch, learning the business from the ground up. He had a natural way with horses and cattle, and Samuel had already said he would have a permanent position whenever he wanted it. Catherine, at 8, was still young enough to believe in magic and fairy tales. She was the light of their lives, keeping Juliana and Franklin young with her endless questions and infectious laughter. One evening in late summer, as Juliana and Franklin sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set, they reflected on their life together. 25 years, Franklin said, shaking his head in wonder. "We have been married for 25 years. Has it really been that long? Seems like yesterday you were planting seeds in frozen ground and I was trying to work up the courage to talk to you." Juliana laughed. "You never seemed nervous to me. I was terrified. You were this beautiful, fierce woman from the East, and I was just a cowboy with dirt under his fingernails." "You were never just anything," she said firmly. "You were exactly what I needed. You still are." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar lines of her palm. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving Philadelphia, marrying me, building this life?" "Never. Not for a single moment, do you? My only regret is that I did not meet you sooner, so we could have had even more years together." "We still have many years ahead of us," she said. "I hope so. I want to grow old with you, Juliana. I want to watch our grandchildren play in this garden you have created. I want to sit on this porch when we are both gray and wrinkled and remember when we were young." "We are not that old yet," she protested. "No, but we are not young anymore either, and that is all right. Every year with you has been a gift." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love you, Franklin Foster. I loved you when I was 22 and planting seeds in frozen ground, and I love you now even more. And I love you. You were my spring, Juliana. You still are." They sat in silence, hand in hand, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear Catherine practicing her piano lesson, the notes floating out on the warm evening air. This was their life. Not perfect, not without its struggles, but rich and full and deeply satisfying. They had built something beautiful together, something that would last long after they were gone. The years continued their steady march. Thomas married a fellow teacher and gave them 2 grandchildren, a boy and a girl. Margaret married a farmer and had 3 children who loved the land as much as she did. Henry took over as foreman of the ranch when Franklin decided to retire at 60, and he married a rancher's daughter, giving them twin boys. Catherine, their baby, became a writer, penning stories about the West that were published in magazines back east. She married late, at 28, to a newspaper editor, and they had 1 son. Juliana and Franklin watched their family grow with pride and joy. Their home was always full of children and grandchildren, especially during holidays and special occasions. The garden that Juliana had started all those years ago had become legendary in the area, and people would travel from far away just to see it in full bloom. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that the whole town attended. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and tears. Franklin stood up, leaning heavily on his cane now, his hair white but his eyes still bright, and raised his glass. "50 years ago, I met a woman who was crazy enough to plant seeds in frozen ground," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I thought she was mad, but I was intrigued. And then I got to know her and I realized she was not mad at all. She had faith. Faith that spring would come, that life would bloom, that beauty could grow even in the harshest conditions." He turned to Juliana, who sat beside him, her own hair silver but her smile as radiant as ever. "You taught me how to hope again, how to love, how to believe in tomorrow. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I thank God every day that you came to Lyndon and into my life. Here is to 50 more years." Everyone laughed at that, knowing 50 more years was unlikely, but they raised their glasses and drank to love and happiness and a life well lived. Juliana stood and kissed Franklin, and the crowd erupted in applause. She looked out at all the faces, her children and grandchildren, friends and neighbors, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "I planted seeds in frozen ground all those years ago," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I was blessed beyond measure when this man helped me tend them. He taught me that waiting for spring is easier when you have someone to wait with you, that blooming is more beautiful when you bloom together. I love you, Franklin Foster, today and always." They kissed again, and the celebration continued late into the night. Franklin passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. Juliana was 74, and losing him felt like losing a part of herself. But she did not fall apart. She mourned him deeply, wearing black for a full year as was proper, but she also continued to live. She continued to tend her garden, though her hands were more gnarled now and the work harder than it used to be. Her children and grandchildren helped, and the garden remained as beautiful as ever, a living testament to the faith and love that had brought it into being. She would sit on her porch in the evenings, in the chair where Franklin used to sit, and talk to him as if he were still there. She told him about the grandchildren's achievements, about the garden's progress, about the small happenings of her days. "I miss you," she would say. "Every single day, I miss you, but I am grateful for every moment we had together." On what would have been their 55th anniversary, she planted a rose bush in the garden, right in the center where it could be seen from the house. It was a hardy variety that would bloom year after year, and she called it the Franklin rose. Juliana lived to be 89 years old, spending her final years surrounded by her family. She passed away in the spring, just as her garden was beginning to bloom, which seemed fitting somehow. At her funeral, Margaret read a passage from her mother's journal, dated December 1873, just after she had first met Franklin. "Today I planted seeds in frozen ground," Juliana had written. "Everyone thinks I am foolish, but I have faith that spring will come and these seeds will bloom. Perhaps I am planting more than just flowers. Perhaps I am planting hope for a future I can only imagine." There was not a dry eye in the church. They buried her next to Franklin in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Lyndon. On her headstone, below her name and dates, they inscribed, "She planted seeds in frozen ground and bloomed with love. The house and garden passed to Margaret, who maintained them with the same care and devotion her mother had shown." The Franklin rose continued to bloom every year, a reminder of the love that had started with a chance meeting and had grown into something that touched multiple generations. Years later, Margaret's own daughter would stand in that garden and tell her children the story of their great-grandparents, about the woman from Philadelphia who had the courage to plant seeds in frozen ground, and the cowboy who had waited for spring and bloomed with her. It was a story about faith and love, about taking chances and believing in tomorrow. It was a story about how the strongest foundations are built on hope, and how the most beautiful gardens grow from the seeds planted in the coldest winters. And it was a story that would be told and retold, passed down through the generations, a reminder that love, like the seasons, is eternal. That spring always comes after winter. And that when you plant seeds with faith and tend them with love, the blooms are more beautiful than you ever imagined possible. The garden in Lyndon, Kansas, still stands today, tended by the descendants of Juliana and Franklin Foster. The Franklin rose still blooms in the center, surrounded by hollyhocks and larkspur, poppies and sweet peas, just as Juliana had planted all those years ago in the frozen December ground. And if you visit on a spring evening when the light is golden and the air is sweet with the scent of flowers, you might almost see them there, Juliana and Franklin, sitting on the porch hand in hand, watching the garden bloom and knowing that love, like the perennials they planted together, returns year after year, season after season, forever and always. Their story was complete, their love immortalized not just in the memories of those who knew them, but in the very earth itself, in every seed that sprouted, every flower that bloomed, every spring that followed the frozen winter. They had taken a chance on each other, these two wounded souls seeking something better, and they had created a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. It was a simple story, really. A woman who planted seeds in frozen ground, a cowboy who helped her tend them. Two people who found each other in a small Kansas town and built a life together, one season at a time, one bloom at a time, one love at a time. And in the end, was that not what life was all about? Planting seeds even when the ground is frozen, believing spring will come, and having the courage to bloom when it does, especially when you have someone to bloom with you.